On July 18th, 1969, 2 days before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, a speech was typed in the White House announcing their deaths. Not as a precaution buried in a filing cabinet. It came with a protocol. Who the president would call, when NASA would cut the radio, what the priest would say. Because everyone involved knew something the public celebration hid. If the single engine on the lunar lander failed to light, there was no rescue. None. Armstrong and Aldrin would be left on the surface, alive and perfectly healthy, waiting for their oxygen to run out. On live television's greatest triumph. And here is the part almost nobody knows. On the moon, that nightmare very nearly began, because of a broken plastic switch and a backpack that bumped a wall. This is the full story of the plan for losing Apollo 11. The odds they hid, the memo they wrote, the switch that snapped, and the felt-tip pen that saved the mission. Chapter 1. The odds they never told you. In public, Apollo 11 was confidence itself. 500,000 people lined the Florida coast. The crew smiled and waved. America was going to the moon. In private, the men in the capsule were running very different numbers. Neil Armstrong later said he believed they had a 90% chance of coming home alive. But only a 50% chance of actually landing. A coin flip. That was the commander's own estimate of the thing the whole world had gathered to watch. The insurance industry agreed with him. No company would write a sane life insurance policy on a man about to ride a Saturn V to another world. So the crew invented their own life insurance. In quarantine before launch, they sat and signed hundreds of postal envelopes. Autographs. The plan was simple and quietly heartbreaking. If they died on the moon, their families would sell the signatures. A dead moonwalker's autograph would pay for college. Those envelopes exist today. Collectors call them insurance covers. They are the physical proof of how the crew really rated their chances. NASA's own engineers had spent years studying the ways the mission could fail. One failure mode stood above all the others. It had no backup, no workaround, and no survivors. It lived in the spidery machine bolted to the top of the rocket, the lunar module. And to understand the death speech, you have to understand this machine. Chapter 2. One engine, no second chances. The lunar module Eagle was 2 spacecraft stacked together. A descent stage with legs for going down, and an ascent stage, the crew cabin, for coming back up. Getting off the moon depended on exactly one thing, the ascent engine. A single rocket motor about the size of a washing machine, with 3,500 pounds of thrust. There was no backup engine. There was no rescue ship. There was no second lunar module waiting in orbit. The engineering philosophy was brutal in its simplicity. Make the one engine so simple it cannot fail. No ignition system because the fuels explode on contact with each other. No fuel pumps because pressurized helium pushes the propellant. Open 2 valves and physics does the rest. That was the theory. But this engine, in this configuration, had never been fired on the moon before. It would get exactly one attempt, in temperatures swinging hundreds of degrees, in a vacuum, covered in abrasive lunar dust, after days of vibration and violence. If it lit, the ascent stage would climb to lunar orbit and meet Michael Collins in the command module. 18 minutes of flight. Routine, if everything worked. If it did not light, Armstrong and Aldrin were dead men in perfect health, standing in the sea of tranquility with the Earth hanging above them. Mission Control could talk to them. Their families could, in principle, say goodbye. And roughly 600 million people would be watching it happen. Somebody in the White House realized the government had no words prepared for that. His name was William Safire. And what he wrote is one of the most haunting documents in American history. Chapter 3. In event of moon disaster. William Safire was Nixon's speechwriter. In July 1969, astronaut Frank Borman, NASA's liaison to the White House, called him with a quiet request. Borman told him to think about, quote, some alternative posture for the president in the event of mishaps. Safire didn't immediately understand. So Borman said it plainly, like what to do for the widows. Safire understood then. The most likely disaster was not an explosion. It was a stranding. On July 18th, while Apollo 11 coasted toward the moon, Safire sent a 2-page memo to Nixon's chief of staff. The subject line, in event of moon disaster. The speech it contained begins like this. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. But they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. And it ends with a line writers still study. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind. Notice what the speech does. It is written in the present tense for men who would still be alive when the president read it. A eulogy for the living. The memo also laid out the protocol around the speech, and this is the part that stays with you. First, before the statement, the president would telephone each of the widows-to-be. That is the memo's actual phrase. Widows-to-be. Their husbands would still be breathing. Second, after the speech, at the point when NASA ends communication with the men, the space agency would deliberately cut the radio link and leave them to the silence. Third, a clergyman would then commend their souls to the deepest of the deep, following the same procedure as a burial at sea. The moon would become a grave, and the ceremony already existed. The memo went into a folder, and everyone hoped it would never come out. The document stayed unknown for 30 years, until an archivist found it in the National Archives in 1999. When it was published, it stunned even Apollo veterans. But in July 1969, it was live policy. And there was one man whose entire role in history would be defined by that memo if it were ever used. Chapter 4. The man who would come home alone. Michael Collins flew to the moon and never touched it. While Armstrong and Aldrin descended, he stayed alone in the command module Columbia, circling 60 miles up. Every orbit took him behind the moon, where the radio died. For 48 minutes at a time, he was cut off from Earth, from his crewmates, from every human being alive. Mission Control called him the loneliest man since Adam. Collins said the loneliness wasn't what scared him. What scared him was the other thing. He wrote it down later. My secret terror for the last 6 months has been leaving them on the moon and returning to Earth alone. If the ascent engine failed, Collins had strict orders. He could not rescue them. Columbia could not land. There was nothing to do but leave. He was blunt about what that would make him. If they fail to rise from the surface, I am not going to commit suicide. I am coming home forthwith. But I will be a marked man for life, and I know it. Imagine that return. 3 weeks of flight, alone, in a ship built for 3. A parade nobody would hold. The one man who came back from mankind's greatest tragedy. Collins kept a small card of emergency procedures. 18 different contingency plans for rescuing the lunar module from a bad orbit. For a dead engine on the surface, there was no card. There was no page. That was the machinery of disaster, fully assembled. A speech. A protocol. A man in orbit rehearsing the worst trip home in history. All of it waiting on one engine. And before that engine even got its chance, the landing itself almost ended everything. Chapter 5. The rehearsals for disaster. Apollo 11 didn't walk into that risk blind. In the 8 months before it, NASA flew 3 full dress rehearsals. Each one came with its own brush with catastrophe. December 1968. Apollo 8 carries the first humans ever to leave Earth orbit. Before launch, Commander Frank Borman's own family privately rated his odds of coming home at 50-50. Their engine burn to leave lunar orbit happened behind the moon, out of radio contact, on Christmas morning. If it failed, 3 men would orbit the moon until their air ran out. Silently. When the ship emerged from behind the moon on time, Jim Lovell radioed the words, "Please be informed, there is a Santa Claus." It was Borman, remember, who later asked Safire to prepare the disaster speech. He had done the math on his own mission. He knew exactly what he was asking for. May 1969, Apollo 10. Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan fly the lunar module Snoopy to within 15 kilometers of the surface. Everything except the landing. During staging, a switch set in the wrong position sends the lunar module into violent tumbling, flipping end over end above the moon, gyrating toward gimbal lock. Cernan's exclamation went out on a hot mic to the whole world. Son of a... well, you can look up the rest. Stafford wrestled the ship back under control in seconds. Analysts later estimated that a few more seconds of tumbling could have ended with Snoopy in the lunar surface, 2 months before Armstrong's landing. So when Eagle undocked in July, nobody involved believed the danger was theoretical. The rehearsals had made one thing clear. The moon punishes small mistakes. Chapter 6. 12 minutes, 5 alarms, 25 seconds. July 20th, 1969. Eagle undocks and begins the 12-minute fall to the lunar surface. Almost immediately, things start going wrong. 5 minutes in, a shrill alarm fills the cabin. Program alarm 1202. Neither astronaut knows what it means. Armstrong's heartbeat starts to climb. In Houston, a 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales has seconds to decide whether to abort the landing of the century. Bales remembers a simulation from weeks earlier. The alarm means the computer is overloaded but still flying. He makes the call. We go on that alarm. The alarms keep coming. 1202, 1201. 5 of them in 4 minutes, each one a heartbeat from an abort. The computer keeps flying. Then Armstrong looks out the window and sees the next problem. The computer is flying them into a crater full of boulders the size of cars. He takes manual control, levels off, and starts flying the lunar module like a helicopter, skimming the surface, hunting for a clear patch. And burning fuel he does not have. In Houston, the fuel callouts start. 60 seconds. The room goes silent. 30 seconds. Nobody in mission control is breathing. Contact light. Engine stop. The Eagle has landed, with roughly 25 seconds of landing fuel left in the tanks. Charlie Duke's answer from Houston says it all. Roger, tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. They were down, and the moment the engine stopped, every mind in the program shifted to the only question that now mattered. Can we get them back up? Chapter 7. Magnificent desolation. Before the famous steps, there was a quiet moment nobody saw. Buzz Aldrin pulled out a small kit from his personal allowance and took communion on the moon. Bread and wine, in 1/6 gravity, the wine curling slowly up the side of the cup. NASA kept it off the broadcast. They were being sued over religious broadcasts from Apollo 8. Then the hatch opened, and for 2.5 hours, the 2 men did what 600 million people will never forget. The steps, the words, the flag. Aldrin described the landscape in 2 words that became immortal: magnificent desolation. Nixon called them from the Oval Office, live, calling it the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. He kept it short. What almost nobody watching knew, the man on the phone had the other speech in a folder. The one that began, "Fate has ordained." The moonwalk ended. The samples were sealed. The 2 men climbed back into the Eagle, repressurized the cabin, and started preparing for the one moment everything depended on: And that is when Buzz Aldrin looked down at the floor and saw something lying in the dust that should not have been there. Chapter 8. The Broken Switch. It was a small black plastic knob. Aldrin picked it up and started scanning the instrument panels, row by row, looking for the socket it had snapped off from. He found it, and his heart sank. Of all the hundreds of breakers in the cabin, the broken one was labelled Engine Arm. The engine arm circuit breaker closed the electrical path that armed the ascent engine. The one engine. The no backup, one attempt, get off the moon engine. In the cramped cabin, one of their bulky life support backpacks had almost certainly knocked it off. The cabin was barely bigger than 2 phone booths. Without that circuit closed, the ascent engine could not be armed. Right there, lying on the floor in the moon dust, was the beginning of the Safire memo. They told Houston, and Houston told them to sleep while the ground worked the problem. Imagine that night, trying to sleep in a machine that may have just become your tomb. Aldrin later wrote that he slept on the floor, cold, with the broken breaker above him. Armstrong slept on the engine cover, under a rigged hammock, staring at the earth through the window. On the ground, engineers debated fixes. Could they route around it? Could a metal pen bridge the contact? Metal risked a short circuit, and a short circuit risked far worse than a dead engine. Aldrin looked at what he had, and in his kit was a felt tip marker. Plastic body. No exposed metal. The tip was just about the width of the breaker slot. In his own words, I inserted the pen into the small opening where the circuit breaker switch should have been and pushed it in. Sure enough, the circuit breaker held. The ascent engine was armed by a pen. Mankind's return ticket from another world, held closed by a piece of stationery. Aldrin kept that pen and the broken breaker for the rest of his life. He said, I use prosaic tools all the time, but none of them ever meant as much. Chapter 9. If the pen had failed. Play the other timeline for a moment, because NASA had played it many times. The countdown reaches 0, the valves open, and nothing happens. The lunar module's remaining consumables gave the crew roughly a day. Battery power and oxygen, ticking down in a cabin the size of a closet, with the whole world listening. There was no version where help arrived. The next lunar module was months from flight readiness. Collins was 60 miles up with no way down. The physics was final. Houston would have tried everything anyway. Every reroute, every jumper, every procedure, until the last hour. That was Mission Control's religion. Work the problem. And when the options ran out, the Safire protocol would have begun. The phone calls to Janet Armstrong and Joan Aldrin. The speech. Fate has ordained. Then the strangest mercy in the whole plan. NASA closing down communications. Not because the radios failed, so the world would not hear the end. What the 2 men would have done with their final hours is something Aldrin was once asked directly. His answer was unsentimental. We weren't going to spend it moaning about it. Some historians believe the crew might have chosen to end things on their own terms rather than wait for the air to thicken. The astronauts themselves rarely discussed it. Some doors stay closed. The moon would carry 2 bodies in Sea of Tranquility, visible to every future mission, preserved unchanged for millions of years. The memo's final line would be literal. Some corner of another world, forever mankind. That timeline died the moment a felt-tip pen clicked into a breaker slot. What happened instead was 18 of the most relieving minutes in human history. Chapter 10. The Ride Home. July 21st. The countdown reaches 0. Aldrin says the words 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. Engine arm ascent. Proceed. The engine lights. First try. The ascent stage leaps off the descent platform in a spray of gold foil and dust, and Aldrin watches the flag whip over in the exhaust. 18 minutes later, they are in lunar orbit. A few hours after that, Collins watches the eagle rise toward him and snaps a photograph of it against the Earth. That photo has a famous caption. Every human being alive or who had ever lived is in this picture, except one. Michael Collins, the man holding the camera. 3 days later, Columbia hit the Pacific. The carrier Hornet pulled them out. Nixon stood grinning at the quarantine window. Reading the speech history got to keep. In a filing cabinet in Washington, the other speech stayed in its folder. 2 pages that came within one plastic switch of being the most famous words of the 20th century. Chapter 11. The Speech That Waits. The memo surfaced in the National Archives in 1999, 30 years late, and it changed how people saw Apollo. The triumph had been real. So had the coffin built next to it. Safire himself said it plainly, years later. If the mission had failed, the president would have had to console the nation. We had to be ready. Nobody wanted to be ready. We were. In 2020, MIT researchers used the memo for something unsettling. They built a deep fake of Nixon actually delivering the moon disaster speech to teach people how synthetic media lies. Watching it is vertigo. The alternate timeline, staring back at you in broadcast grey. The saddest speech never given, given anyway, by a machine. Here is what this story is really about. Apollo 11 succeeded not because failure was impossible, but because failure was planned for in exact, unflinching detail. The people who wrote death protocols and the people who armed engines with felt-tip pens were the same organization. Hope for everything. Prepare for the worst thing you can say out loud. Every mission since carries that lesson. And somewhere in a drawer, there is always a version of the speech. For Artemis. For Mars. Written in advance, hoped never to be read. Because that is the honest price of exploration. Somebody has to write the words for the day the engine doesn't light. If this story gripped you, watch our full documentary on every disaster in spaceflight history. The missions where the speech did get read, and subscribe to Mindwired for a new story every week. If any of this messed with your head a little, well, that's exactly the point. And it only happens because people like you keep showing up. And
hit subscribe right now for it. It costs you nothing, and it's the entire reason Mindwired keeps making videos like this. Subscribe.